Deep in the Montana wilderness, a man with calloused hands and a wounded heart takes on what seems like a simple job. Mason Holt has been drifting from town to town since tragedy struck his family, finding peace only in the rhythm of honest work and the silence of the mountains. When he answers a handwritten flyer offering good pay to build a remote cabin, he expects another straightforward construction job. What he doesn't expect is Clara Wynn, a woman whose soft voice and determined spirit seem oddly out of place among the pine trees and morning frost. She insists on helping with the build despite having no experience. And as autumn days grow shorter, something deeper begins to take shape between hammer strikes and shared meals by the fire. But Clara carries a secret that could change everything about their quiet mountain refuge. What happens when the woman paying his wages turns out to be worth more money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The handwritten flyer had been tucked between a grocery store, bulletin boards, layers of forgotten yard sales and lost pet notices, its edges curled from moisture and time. Mason Holt had almost walked past it entirely, his mind focused on picking up supplies before heading to his next temporary job. But something about the careful penmanship caught his eye, the kind of deliberate cursive that spoke of someone who still believed in taking time with things. Seeking skilled carpenter for remote cabin construction, mountain location, generous compensation, serious inquiries only, discretion appreciated. Below that, a phone number written in the same measured hand. Mason had been drifting for 3 years now, ever since the accident that took his brother Danny and shattered what remained of their family. 3 years of moving from job to job, town to town, carrying nothing but his worn tool belt and the weight of guilt that never seemed to lighten. He'd worked ranches in Wyoming, repaired barns in Colorado, and built decks for vacation homes whose owners would never know his name. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too, far into the dark places where Danny's last words echoed. The tool belt hanging from his truck's passenger seat told the story of those years, leather worn smooth from use, each tool in its designated place. The hammer's handle bore the slight depression where his thumb naturally rested. The measuring tape's case showed scratches from countless projects. These tools had become extensions of himself, reliable in a way that people rarely were. They didn't ask questions about his past or wonder why a man his age lived out of a truck and never mentioned family. He'd called the number from a payphone outside the grocery store, half expecting voicemail or a disconnected line. Instead, a woman answered on the second ring, her voice soft but certain. "This is Clara. I'm calling about the carpenter job." "The flyer?" A pause then. "Are you available for an extended project? The location is quite remote." "Remote works for me." "Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I'll give you directions." The drive took him deep into the Bitterroot Mountains, along roads that grew narrower and less maintained with each mile. Mason's truck, a reliable Ford that had seen better decades, handled the terrain with the steady competence of something built to work rather than impress. A GPS signal had died 20 miles back, leaving him to follow the handwritten directions. Clara had provided turn at the lightning-struck pine. Follow the creek until you see the meadow. Look for the red flag. The landscape here carried the kind of silence that most people found unsettling, but that Mason had come to crave. Towering pines filtered the morning light into cathedral beams that danced with dust and tiny insects. The air held the crisp bite of elevation and the green scent of growing things unbothered by human presence. This was country that demanded respect, where a wrong turn could leave you lost for days, where winter arrived without warning and stayed until it was good and ready to leave. He found the red flag tied to a trail marker where the dirt road ended. Beyond it, a footpath wound through the trees toward what the directions promised was a clearing suitable for building. Mason shouldered his tool belt, grabbed his thermos of coffee, and started walking. The clearing, when he reached it, took his breath away. A natural meadow stretched before him, bordered by trees but open to the sky, with a view of snow-capped peaks that seemed to go on forever. A small creek ran along the eastern edge, its water clear and cold. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and green that no photograph could capture. She was waiting for him. Their Clara Wynn stood near the center of the clearing, her back to him as she surveyed the view. She wore hiking pants that looked expensive but practical, boots that were clearly new but sensibly chosen, and a wool sweater in deep forest green. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, Mason found himself looking into eyes the color of mountain lakes blue-green and unexpectedly deep. "Mr. Holt?" Her voice carried the same quiet certainty he'd heard on the phone. "Mason's fine." He stopped a respectful distance away, his practiced eye already assessing the clearing. "This is beautiful country." "Yes, it is." She looked around the meadow with something approaching reverence. "I'd like to build here, if you think it's suitable. The drainage looks good, and that rise there would give you a solid foundation. But I have to ask, how did you find this place? And how are we going to get materials up here?" Clara smiled, and it transformed her face entirely. Where expression had been composed, almost guarded, the smile revealed something warmer underneath. "I have my ways. There's an old logging road that comes within half a mile. We can use ATVs for smaller items, and I've arranged for helicopter delivery for the larger materials." Mason raised an eyebrow. Helicopter delivery wasn't exactly standard practice for remote construction, but then again, nothing about this job felt standard. "That's going to run up quite a bill. Cost isn't a concern." She said it simply, without boast or apology. "What matters is doing this right." He studied her more carefully then. Clara appeared to be in her early 30s, though something in. Her bearing suggested she'd packed more experience into those years than most. Her skin had the pale quality of someone who spent time indoors, but her handshake when they'd met had been firm and her gaze direct. There was money here, that much was obvious from the helicopter comment and her unconcerned attitude toward expense. But there was something else too, something that made her choose this remote location and seek out a drifter carpenter rather than an established contractor. "What kind of cabin are we talking about?" Mason asked. Clara pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket. Architectural drawings, rendered in the same careful handwriting as the flyer. The design was elegant but not ostentatious, focused on function and integration with the landscape. 2 bedrooms, an open living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen designed for someone who actually cooked rather than just reheated. Large. Windows to capture the views, a wraparound porch that would be perfect for morning coffee and evening reflection. "It's beautiful," Mason said, and meant it. "How long have you been planning this?" "Longer than you might think." Clara folded the drawings carefully. "I'm not in any hurry. I'd rather it be done right than done fast." There was something in the way she said it that made Mason look at her more closely. In his experience, people who weren't in a hurry were usually running from something that moved slower than they did. But Clara didn't have the jittery energy of someone being chased. If anything, she seemed to be moving toward something rather than away from it. "I should tell you," she continued, "I'd like to help with the construction. I know I don't have experience, but I'm willing to learn." Mason had worked with enthusiastic amateurs before, and the results were usually more hindrance than help. But something in Clara's tone suggested this wasn't about playing it, being outdoorsy, or having something to post on social media. There was a hunger in her voice, a need that went deeper than wanting to swing a hammer. "It's hard work," he warned, "and potentially dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Then teach me." 2 words, spoken with quiet determination. Mason found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to take the job. "When do we start?" "How about now?" "Clara, gestured toward a camp setup he hadn't noticed before, a high-quality tent. Camping equipment that looked barely used, but carefully chosen. I've been staying here for a few days, getting a feel for the place. Mason looked around the clearing again, his contractor's mind already organizing the work ahead. Foundation first, then framing, utilities, roofing, finishing work. It would take most of the summer and well into fall, especially with an inexperienced helper. Long days in beautiful country, building something meaningful with his hands. It had been a while since a job felt like more than just another way to pass time. "All right," he said. "Let's build you a cabin." Clara's smile returned, brighter than before. "Thank you, Mason. I think this is going to be exactly what I need." As they began discussing logistics and timelines, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who might end up getting exactly what he needed. Though what that might be, he couldn't yet say. The first helicopter arrived at dawn 3 days later, its rotors thundering across the peaceful meadow like mechanical thunder. Mason had been up since 5, marking the foundation layout with spray paint and wooden stakes, when the aircraft peered over the tree line. He watched as it lowered a pallet of concrete mix and rebar with the precision of a surgeon, the pilot barely disturbing the wildflowers at the meadow's edge. Clara emerged from her tent as the helicopter departed. Her hair tousled, but her expression alert. She wore the same practical clothes as their first meeting, but Mason noticed her expensive hiking boots were already showing, signs of real used scuffed leather and dirt that spoke of someone learning to navigate uneven ground. "Right on time," she said, approaching the delivered materials with satisfaction. "Your pilot's got skill," Mason acknowledged, hefting a bag of concrete mix. "This is going to save us days of hauling." They worked through the morning in companionable silence, Mason explaining the process as they prepared for the foundation dig. Clara proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes in a small leather journal she kept in her jacket pocket. Her hands, he noticed, were soft but not pampered, no manicure, no jewelry except for a simple watch that looked both expensive and practical. "Tell me about your family," Clara said during their lunch break as they sat on a fallen log sharing sandwiches she'd prepared. The question caught Mason off guard. "Not much to tell," he said carefully. "My brother Danny and I worked construction together. He died in a logging accident 3 years ago." Clara waited, understanding that silence sometimes drew out more than questions. "Family blamed me," Mason continued, surprised at his own honesty. "Said I should have been there, should have stopped him from taking that job. Maybe they were right." "Were you supposed to be there?" "No, I was working another site." "But Danny?" Mason paused, remembering Danny was always the one who took risks. Climbed higher, worked faster, pushed harder. I was the careful one, always telling him to slow down, be safe. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Ironic that the one time I wasn't there to worry about him was the time something actually happened. Clara's response surprised him. Guilt is a strange thing. It makes us believe we have more control over the world than we actually do. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience. Mason looked at her more closely, noting the way her fingers worried at the edge of her journal. "What about you?" he asked. "What brings someone to the middle of nowhere to build a cabin?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I spent a lot of years building things that didn't matter," she finally said. "I thought it was time to try building something that did." It wasn't really an answer, but Mason recognized the careful deflection of someone protecting old wounds. He'd become an expert at those himself. The afternoon brought their first real test as a team. Mason had Clara help him dig the foundation trenches, showing her how to use the pickaxe safely and efficiently. She attacked the work with determination, but little technique. And within an hour, Mason could see she was pushing herself beyond her limits. "Take a break," he suggested, but Clara shook her head. I can keep going. I'm sure you can, but there's no rush. I need to pull my weight. There was an edge to her voice that made Mason pause. He'd heard that tone before, from people who had something to prove to others or to themselves. You are pulling your weight, he said gently. But construction isn't a race. It's about doing things right, not fast. Clara stopped digging and leaned on her shovel, breathing hard. I'm not used to, not being good at things. It was an admission that revealed more than she'd probably intended. Mason filed it away with his other observations about Clara Wynn. The expensive gear, the helicopter delivery, the casual dismissal of cost. And now this, someone accustomed to competence being frustrated by her own inexperience. Nobody's good at everything from the start, Mason said. The trick is being willing to learn. They worked until the sun began to set, making real progress on the foundation trenches. As they packed up their tools, Clara stumbled slightly on the uneven ground. Mason reached out instinctively to steady her, his hand catching her elbow. The contact was brief, but electric the first time they'd touched beyond their initial handshake. Thank you, Clara said, her voice softer than usual. Careful, Mason replied, though he wasn't sure if he was warning her about the ground or something else entirely. That evening, they sat by the camp stove as Clara prepared dinner, a surprisingly sophisticated meal given their remote location. She moved around the makeshift kitchen with efficiency, producing fresh vegetables, good bread, and what appeared to be high-quality olive oil from her supplies. You cook, Mason observed. I find it relaxing. Clara glanced at him as she chopped vegetables. Do you? Mostly I heat things up. Bachelor food. Never married? The question was casual, but Mason sensed genuine curiosity behind it. Came close once. But I wasn't very good at staying put. Even before Danny died, she wanted stability, and I wanted something else. I'm not sure what. And now? Mason considered the question. Now, I'm not sure I'm good for anyone. Too much baggage, too much wandering. Clara set down her knife and looked at him directly. I think you're selling yourself short. There was something in her expression that made Mason's chest tighten. An openness, a warmth that seemed to see past the walls he'd built around himself. It was dangerous, this feeling of being understood by someone he barely knew. What about? You? He asked. Someone waiting for you back in the city? Clara's smile was wry. There was. But it turned out he was more interested in what I could do for his career than in me. She resumed chopping, her movements more precise now. Amazing how many people want to be close to you when you're useful. To them. Another piece of the puzzle that was Clara Wynn, someone who'd been used, who'd learned to be wary of people's motives. It explained the remote location, the careful deflection of personal questions, the hunger to learn something real and tangible. They ate by firelight, a conversation flowing more easily than it had any right to between two people who'd known each other for less than a week. Clara asked about Mason's work, genuinely interested in the technical aspects of construction. Mason found himself explaining not just the how, but the why, the satisfaction of creating something lasting, the pleasure of solving problems with your hands. I envy you, Clara said as they finished eating. Why? You create things that matter. That last, that serve a purpose. So do you, I'm sure. Clara's laugh was bitter. I used to think so, but I'm not sure anymore. She stood abruptly and began clearing the dishes, effectively ending the conversation. Mason watched her move around the campsite, noting the precise way she organized everything, the efficiency of her movements. There was discipline here, the kind that came from high-pressure environments and demanding standards. As they prepared for bed, Clara to her tent, Mason to his sleeping bag under the stars. She paused at her tent flap. Mason? Yeah? Thank you for being patient with me today, for not making me feel foolish. You're not foolish. You're learning. Still, it means something. She disappeared into her tent, leaving Mason alone with the fire and his thoughts. He lay back in his sleeping bag, looking up at stars that city dwellers never saw, listening to the night sounds of the forest. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The creek whispered its endless song. And from Clara's tent came the soft sound of pages turning. She was writing in that journal again. Mason found himself wondering what she wrote about, what thoughts she committed to paper by the light of her small camping lantern. He wondered about the pain he'd heard in her voice when she mentioned being used, about the bitterness when she spoke of her past work. Most of all, he wondered why a woman who could afford helicopter deliveries and expensive gear had chosen to spend her. Summer learning to build a cabin with a drifter who carried his life in a tool belt. But those were questions for another day. Tomorrow they would pour concrete and begin the real work of building. Tomorrow they would continue this careful dance of revelation and concealment, of two wounded people finding their way towards something that might, with luck and care, become trust. The fire died to embers as Mason drifted toward sleep, the weight of Clara's gratitude settling around him like a blanket. It had been a long time since someone had thanked him for being patient, for not making them feel foolish. It had been a long time since his presence had seemed to matter to anyone beyond his ability to complete a job dot as consciousness faded. Mason's last thought was that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth staying put for. The routine they established over the following weeks had the rhythm of something that had always existed. Mason woke with the sun, started coffee on the camp stove, and began his morning inspection of the previous day's work. Clara emerged from her tent shortly after, hair braided for the workday, carrying that leather journal and her growing collection of construction notes. They poured the foundation on a crisp morning, when the mountains wore caps of fresh snow despite the summer season. Clara proved surprisingly adept at mixing concrete, her academic approach to learning paying dividends as she carefully measured water and additives. Mason found himself carving a simple wooden spoon from a piece of pine during their lunch break, the kind of mindless work that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. "What's that for?" Clara asked, watching him smooth the bowl with careful strokes of his knife. "You," Mason said without thinking, then felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean, for the camp kitchen. Figured you could use a decent spoon instead of those plastic ones." Clara accepted the finished spoon with a solemnity that made Mason wonder if anyone had made her anything by hand before. She turned it over in her fingers, testing the weight and balance, running her thumb along the smooth grain. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "Thank you." Something shifted between them in that moment, subtle but unmistakable. The spoon was simple, practical, made from scraps, but it represented something more. Time taken, care given, the desire to provide comfort for someone else. Clara tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket, treating it like the treasure it had unexpectedly become. Their conversations grew longer as the days passed, stretching from work-related discussions to more personal territory. Clara proved to be an excellent listener, asking questions that drew Mason out of his usual reticence. She wanted to know about the places he'd worked, the people he'd met, the satisfaction he found in creating things with his hands. "I've never built anything," Clara admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "Not really. Everything in my life has been abstract. Numbers on screens, contracts and negotiations, things that exist mostly in people's minds." "What kind of work?" Mason asked, though he suspected the answer would be another careful deflection. "Business, strategy, and development." Clara stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkness. Very important at the time, very urgent, very hollow, as it turned out. Mason waited, understanding by now that Clara needed space to decide how much to reveal. "I spent years building something I thought mattered," she continued. "Turns out I was just making rich people richer, while convincing myself I was changing the world." Her laugh was rueful. Amazing how easy it is to lie to yourself when everyone around you is telling the same lie. So you walked away? Eventually. Not soon enough, but eventually. Clara looked at him across the fire. What about you? Ever think about doing something else? Mason considered the question. I tried office work once, right after high school. Lasted about 6 weeks. Couldn't. Breathe in there. Always felt like the walls were closing in. But construction doesn't feel like that. No. When you're building something, you can see the progress every day. You put up a wall, install a window, lay a floor, it's all real. Solid. When you're done, people can live in what you made. Use it. Pass it down to their children. Mason poked at the fire with his own stick. Hard to argue with that kind of purpose. Clara was quiet for a long moment. I envy that certainty. What do you mean? Knowing that your work matters. Having that confidence in your purpose. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I used to think I knew what I was doing, why it mattered. But when everything fell apart, I realized I didn't know anything at all. There was pain in her voice, old and deep. Mason found himself wanting to ask what had fallen apart, what had driven her to this remote meadow to build a cabin with a stranger. But he'd learned to recognize the boundaries Clara drew around certain subjects, and he respected them even as his curiosity grew. Instead, he told her about Danny. My brother was fearless, Mason said, surprising himself with the words. Not reckless exactly, but he never met a challenge he wouldn't take on. Always pushing limits, always sure he could handle whatever came his way. Mason smiled at the memory. Used to drive me crazy, how confident he was. How certain. You missed that about him. It wasn't a question. And Mason appreciated that Clara understood the difference between missing someone and missing the qualities they'd possessed. I miss believing the world was conquerable, Mason admitted. Danny never doubted that if he worked hard enough, took enough risks, cared enough, things would work out. Even when they didn't, he'd just dust himself off and try again. And you? I learned that sometimes caring isn't enough. Sometimes working hard just gets you hurt. Sometimes the world wins no matter what you do. Clara reached across the space between them and touched his hand briefly. Gesture of comfort that lasted only seconds, but left Mason's skin tingling. I'm sorry you learned that, she said. I'm sorry you did too. They sat in comfortable silence. After that, a fire crackling between them, while night sounds filled the forest around their small camp. Mason found himself studying Clara's profile in the firelight, noting the way shadows played across her features. She was beautiful, he realized, though not in the obvious way that drew attention in a crowd. Hers was a quieter beauty, the kind that revealed itself slowly through expressions and gestures, through the tilt of her head when she was thinking, or the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. The next morning brought a complication that tested their growing partnership. The framing. Lumber arrived via helicopter, but the pilot miscalculated the drop and scattered 2x4s across a wider area than planned. Some pieces landed in the creek, others in the undergrowth at the meadow's edge. Well, that's inconvenient, Clara said, surveying the scattered lumber with remarkable equanimity. Mason was less sanguine. That's a day's work just gathering everything up, and anything that landed in the water might be warped by the time we get to it, and we'd better get started. They spent the morning retrieving lumber, Clara proving surprisingly strong as she helped Mason carry the longer pieces back to their building site. She'd learned to lift with her legs, to coordinate her movements with his, to watch for obstacles in her path. The inexperienced city woman who'd struggled with a shovel was transforming into someone who could handle herself in the wilderness. During one particularly awkward retrieval, a 16-foot beam, wedged between two trees, Clara lost her footing on the uneven ground. Mason caught her instinctively, his arms wrapping around her waist to steady her. For a moment they stood frozen, her back pressed against his chest. both breathing hard from exertion and something else entirely. "Okay?" Mason asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Okay," Clara whispered, but she didn't immediately pull away. This moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the growing awareness that whatever was building alongside, the cabin was becoming impossible to ignore. Finally, Clara stepped forward, breaking the contact, but not before Mason felt her lean back against him just slightly, a gesture so brief he might have imagined it. "We should get this beam back to the site," she said, her voice carefully normal. "Right, the beam." They worked with focused determination for the rest of the day, but Mason found his awareness of Clara heightened in ways that had nothing to do with construction safety. He noticed how she'd learned to anticipate his movements, how she positioned herself to be most useful, how her confidence grew with each completed task. That evening, Clara used his handmade spoon to eat her dinner, and Mason felt a warm satisfaction at seeing his work put to its intended purpose. She caught him watching and smiled, one of those open, unguarded expressions that was becoming more frequent as the days passed. "Best spoon I've ever owned," she said. "It's just a piece of pine." "No," Clara said seriously, "it's not." And Mason understood that she was right. It wasn't just wood anymore. It was proof that they were building more than a cabin in this remote meadow. They were building something between them, fragile still, undefined, but real as anything made with hammer and nails. The cabin's frame rose against the mountain backdrop like the skeleton of some great wooden creature, its bones straight and true under Mason's careful guidance. Clara had progressed from awkward helper to competent assistant, her movements more confident as she learned to read the subtle language of construction. She could now predict when Mason would need the level, hand him tools before he asked, and spot potential problems before they became costly mistakes. It was during the installation of the wall studs that Clara found the wildflower, a delicate purple bloom, growing in an impossible crack in a boulder near their worksite. She pressed it carefully between the pages of Mason's work notebook, her fingers gentle as she smoothed the petals flat. "For luck," she explained when Mason discovered it later, though something in her expression suggested deeper meaning. This flower became a talisman of sorts, marking the moment when their partnership deepened into something that felt increasingly like intimacy. They moved around each other with growing ease, developed their own shorthand for communication, shared jokes that would have made no sense to outsiders. Clara's laughter, when Mason coaxed it from her, had a musical quality that made him want to keep finding reasons to hear it. "Tell me about the places you've lived," Clara said one afternoon as they worked on installing windows. She was holding the frame steady while Mason adjusted the hardware, their faces close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her shampoo mixed with sawdust and mountain air. Lots of small towns, some cities when work was scarce. Mason concentrated on the screws, using the task to manage his awareness of her proximity. Never stayed long enough to really know any of them. That sounds lonely. Maybe, or maybe it's freedom. Is there a difference? Mason paused in his work, considering. I used to think so. And now? Now I'm not sure what I think about anything. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, this place feels different, doesn't it? Like it could be somewhere, to stay. There was careful hope in her voice, and Mason realized she was asking about more than just the geographical appeal of their mountain meadow. She was asking if he could imagine staying here, with her, in whatever they were building together. "Yeah?" he said quietly. "It does." The storm arrived without much warning 3 days later, rolling in from the west with a kind of determination that made experienced mountain dwellers take notice. Mason had been watching the sky all morning, noting the way the wind shifted and the quality of light changed. By noon, he was securing tools and equipment. "We need to get everything under cover," he told Clara. "This is going to be a big one." They worked quickly to protect their progress, covering exposed wood with tarps and moving sensitive materials into the partial shelter of the framed walls. The first drops of rain arrived as they finished, fat and cold with the promise of worse to come. "Your tent isn't going to hold up in this," Mason said, eyeing Clara's camping setup with concern. "I'll be fine. Clara, this isn't a summer shower. Mountain storms can be dangerous." As if to prove his point, a crack of thunder rolled across the meadow, followed immediately by lightning that turned the darkening afternoon white for an instant. The rain intensified, driving sideways now with wind that bent the trees and turned the air itself into a living thing. "We need to get to the cabin," Mason shouted over the storm. "The frame will give us some protection." They ran for the partial structure, Clara's hand in his, as they navigated the suddenly treacherous ground. The framed walls provided shelter from the wind, though rain still found its way through the gaps where windows and doors would eventually be. Mason spread his sleeping bag in the driest corner and motioned for Clara to sit beside him. She hesitated for just a moment, then settled next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The storm raged around them, turning their mountain refuge into something wild and primordial. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, stuttering frames. Thunder shook the ground beneath them. "I've never been in a storm like this," Clara admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Mountain weather doesn't mess around," Mason replied. "But we're safe here. The frame is solid." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching nature display its power through the gaps in their shelter. The air smelled of rain and pine, ozone and wet earth. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, and Mason found himself studying her profile in the intermittent lightning flashes. "Can I tell you something?" Clara said suddenly. "Of course. I've never felt safer anywhere than I do right here with you in the middle of this storm." The admission hung between them, more intimate than their previous conversations had ventured. Mason felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of defenses he'd maintained for 3 years. "Clara," he started, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he was feeling. "I know we haven't known each other long," she continued, "and I know I haven't been completely honest about my past. But this," she gestured around their makeshift shelter, "this feels more real than anything I've experienced in years." Mason turned to face her fully, noting the way the stormlight played across her features. "What haven't you told me?" Clara was quiet for so long that Mason thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I used to run a company, a big one. I thought I was building something important, something that would change the world for the better." She paused, gathering courage. "I was wrong. About the company, about the people I trusted, about what I thought I was accomplishing. What happened? I made decisions that I thought were right. Decisions that cost people their jobs, their savings, their trust." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "When it all came apart, everyone needed someone to blame. I was convenient." Mason reached over and covered her hands with one of his, stilling their nervous movement. "You don't strike me as someone who'd hurt people intentionally. Intention doesn't matter when the results are the same, doesn't it?" Clara looked at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I had power, influence, resources. People trusted me to do right by them, and I failed. I failed completely. So you came here, so I ran here. There's a difference." Mason was quiet for a moment, processing her revelation. It explained the expensive gear, the casual attitude toward helicopter deliveries, the sense that she was accustomed to competence and frustrated by inexperience. It also explained the careful boundaries around certain topics, the pain in her voice when she spoke of being used. "Running towards something isn't the same as running away," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "You're here learning to build things with your hands, learning to create something real and useful. That doesn't sound like running away to me." Clara leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder. Mason felt the rightness of it, the way her body fit against his, as if they'd been designed to occupy the same space. "I was so tired of being someone I didn't recognize," she whispered, "of living a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And now? Now I'm learning who I might be if I had the choice." They stayed like that as the storm gradually spent its fury, Clara's warmth against his side and her breath stirring the collar of his shirt. Mason found himself memorizing the moment, the sound of rain on canvas tarps, the scent of her hair, the weight of her trust as she shared her deepest regrets. When the rain finally stopped and the first stars appeared, through breaking clouds, Clara lifted her head to look at him. Her face was close enough that Mason could count her eyelashes, could see the flecks of gold in her blue-green eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not judging. For making me feel like the person I am here matters more than the person I was back there." Mason cupped her face gently in his palm, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "The person you are here is the only one I've ever known. And she's—" He paused, searching for words adequate to what he felt. "She's extraordinary." Clara's eyes fluttered closed at his touch, and for a moment Mason thought she might close the distance between them. The possibility hung in the air like the lingering electricity from the storm. But then she pulled back slightly, her expression mixing desire with uncertainty. "Mason, I need you to know I'm not just taking a vacation here. I'm not going back to that life. Whatever this is between us, it's not temporary for me." The declaration was both promise and challenge, asking him to consider what he wanted beyond the summer's work. Mason felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect himself from the possibility of loss. But looking at Clara's open, vulnerable expression, he found his usual defenses crumbling. "Good," he said simply. "Because I'm tired of temporary." Clara's smile was radiant, transforming her face with joy and relief. They might have kissed then, might have crossed that final line between friendship and something deeper. But a distant rumble reminded them that the storm might not be finished. Instead, they settled back against each other, Clara's head on Mason's shoulder and his arm around her waist. They watched the last of the clouds clear away to reveal stars brilliant enough to make the city dweller in Clara gasp with wonder. "I've never seen so many," she breathed. "Light pollution hides them in most places," Mason explained. "Out here, you can see what the sky really looks like." "Like everything else here," Clara murmured. "More real than what I'm used to." They fell asleep eventually, still wrapped together in Mason's sleeping bag, the storm having washed the air clean and left their small world feeling newly made. Mason's last conscious thought was that he'd found something worth more than all the jobs he'd drifted through, worth more than the safety of solitude he'd maintained since Danny's death. He'd found someone who saw him clearly and chose to stay anyway. The morning after the storm dawned crystalline and fresh, the air so clean it seemed to ring like a bell when Mason breathed it in. Clara woke in his arms, her face peaceful in sleep until awareness returned and brought with it a flush of color across her cheeks. They disentangled carefully, both hyper-aware of the line they'd approached, but not yet crossed. "Coffee?" Mason offered, his voice rougher than usual. "Please." The solar-powered radio Clara had brought crackled to life as Mason prepared breakfast, picking up fragments of morning news from distant stations. Clara moved to adjust the antenna, her expression tightening as clear voices emerged from the static. Stocks continued their volatile trading as investors await news on the Innovate Solutions bankruptcy proceedings. Clara's hand froze on the radio dial. Mason watched her face carefully, noting the way her shoulders tensed at the business terminology flowing from the speakers. Former CEO Clara Wynn remains unavailable for comment, though sources suggest she may be preparing a statement regarding her role in the company's collapse. Clara switched the radio off with sharp, decisive movement, But the damage was done. The outside world had intruded into their mountain sanctuary, bringing with it reminders of the life she'd fled. "Clara," Mason said gently. "It's nothing," she replied, but her voice carried a brittleness that hadn't been there the night before. "Just noise." Mason studied her profile as she busied herself organizing their camping supplies with unnecessary precision. The vulnerable woman who'd shared her fears during the storm had retreated behind walls he was only beginning to understand. Work on the cabin progressed steadily over the following days, but Mason noticed changes in Clara's behavior. She threw herself into the construction with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if building faster could somehow outrun whatever she was hiding from. Her questions about technique became more pointed, more strategic. "How long would it take to frame a house this size with a full crew?" she asked one afternoon as they installed roof trusses. "Depends on the crew." "Why?" "Just curious about efficiency, about scaling up operations." There was something in her tone that reminded Mason of the business executive the radio had mentioned. Clara caught his questioning look and forced a smile. "Sorry, old habits. I used to analyze everything in terms of optimization and resource allocation. Must be hard to turn that off." "Harder than you'd think." They were interrupted by the distant sound of an engine, the first mechanical noise they'd heard in weeks apart from their helicopter deliveries. Clara's entire body went rigid at the sound, her hands stilling on the beam she'd been positioning. "Expecting someone?" Mason asked. "No, no one knows I'm here." The engine sound grew closer, resolving into the distinctive growl of a four-wheel drive vehicle navigating rough terrain. Clara moved to the edge of the clearing, her posture alert and defensive in a way that made Mason's protective instincts flare. A battered pickup truck emerged from the tree line, dust trailing behind it like a brown banner. The driver was a weathered man in his 60s, wearing the kind of practical clothes that marked him as local. He climbed out slowly, favoring his left leg. "Afternoon," he called, raising one hand in greeting. "Name's Bill Hendricks. One run the nearest ranch, about 10 miles south." Mason stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Clara and the newcomer. "Mason Holt. This is Clara." Bill's eyes moved between them, taking in the construction site, the camping setup, the obvious signs of extended habitation. Heard helicopter activity up this way. Figured I'd check it out. We don't get many folks building in these parts. "Private project," Mason said carefully. "I can see that." Bill's gaze lingered on Clara, and Mason caught something like recognition in the older man's expression. "You folks planning to be here through winter?" "That's the idea," Clara said, finding her voice. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Mason could see tension in the set of her shoulders. "Winter's hard up here. Food deliveries get impossible once the snow hits. Might want to think about stocking up come fall." It was good advice, offered in a neighborly spirit, but Clara treated it like a threat assessment. "We'll manage." Bill nodded slowly, his attention moving to their construction progress. "Fine work," he told Mason. "You know what you're doing. Been at it a while, I can tell." Bill turned back to Clara. "Ma'am, I don't mean to pry, but you look familiar. You ever been through these parts before?" Clara's face went carefully blank. "I don't think so." Must be my imagination." Bill climbed back into his truck, then paused with the door open. "You folks need anything supplies, advice about the weather, whatever, you know where to find me. These mountains can be unforgiving to people who aren't prepared." After he drove away, Clara remained standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at the dust cloud marking his departure. "He seemed nice enough," Mason said. "He recognized me. Maybe. Or maybe you just have one of those faces." Clara turned to him, her expression grim. "I don't have one of those faces, Mason. I have the kind of face that ends up on magazine covers and business news programs. The kind people remember." The admission hung between them, another piece of the puzzle that was Clara's past. Mason began to understand the scope of whatever she'd walked away from, not just a failed business, but a level of public visibility that made true anonymity nearly impossible. Does it matter? He asked. It might. If word gets out that I'm here. Clara shook her head. I just need more time. Time to figure out who I am when I'm not being watched, judged, analyzed. That evening, Clara was quieter than usual as they prepared dinner. She moved through the familiar tasks with distracted efficiency, her mind clearly elsewhere. The solar radio remained silent by mutual unspoken agreement. Tell me about your brother, she said suddenly as they sat by the fire. Not the accident. Before that, what was he like? Mason was surprised by the request, but something in Clara's expression suggested she needed the distraction of someone else's story. Danny was. Light, I guess. Everything seemed easier when he was around. He had this way of making people believe things would work out, even when they obviously wouldn't. Mason smiled at the memory. He could talk his way into, or out of anything. Convinced our mother to let him climb trees when he was 4 by explaining the aerodynamic properties of squirrels. He sounds wonderful. He was. He was also frustrating as hell. Never met a risk he wouldn't take, never encountered a problem he thought couldn't be solved with enough optimism and elbow grease. Mason poked at the fire with a stick. Used to drive me crazy how everything seemed to come easy to him. But you loved him more than anything. He was my best friend, my business partner, Mason paused, searching for words. He was the person who made me believe I could be better than I was. Clara was quiet for a long moment. What would he think of this? Of you being here? Honestly? He'd probably be giving me grief about taking so long to kiss the pretty girl. The words slipped out before Mason could stop them, carrying more honesty than he'd intended. Clara looked up from the fire, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. Hope, maybe, or invitation. Mason. I know we said we're taking things slow, he continued, emboldened by her expression. But I need you to know whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't change how I feel about you. You don't know everything about me yet. I know enough. I know you're kind and determined and braver than you think. I know you make terrible coffee, but excellent. Everything else. I know you're the first person in 3 years who's made me want to stop running from my own life. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What if my past catches up with us? What if staying here becomes impossible? Then we'll figure it out together. The word hung between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Clara stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of their firelight. I've spent so many years being defined by other people's expectations, she said, her back to him. I'm terrified of disappointing you, too. Mason rose and moved behind her, close enough to speak softly at her ear. The only way you could disappoint me is if you stopped being yourself. Clara leaned back against him, and Mason wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, both of them acutely aware that they were balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. I care about you, Clara, Mason said finally. Whatever name you used in your old life, whatever mistakes you think you made, whoever might be looking for you, none of that changes what's happening between us. Clara turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. I care about you, too. More than I ever thought I could care about anyone. This time, when the moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, neither one pulled away. Mason cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Clara's eyes fluttered closed as he leaned down, their foreheads touching. Are you sure? He whispered. I've never been more sure of anything. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered. But as Clara's arms came up around his neck and she pressed closer to him, It deepened into something that spoke of promises and possibilities, of two people choosing each other despite the uncertainties that surrounded them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara smiled up at him with an expression of wonder and joy. "Danny would approve," she said softly. Mason laughed, the sound carrying a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "Yeah, he would. Though he'd probably have locked us in a closet weeks ago to speed things along." They held each other close as the fire died to embers, both aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever challenges Clara's past might bring, whatever obstacles they'd face in building a life together, they would face them as partners now. The mountains stood silent around them, keeping their secret safe beneath a canopy of stars. The days following their first kiss carried a new quality of intimacy that transformed even the most mundane tasks. Clara's hand would brush Mason's as she passed him tools. He would steady her with a touch that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Their evening conversations stretched deeper into the night, punctuated by stolen kisses and the growing comfort of physical closeness. Mason found himself studying Clara with new eyes, noticing details he'd overlooked before. The way she unconsciously straightened her posture when discussing anything remotely business-related. How her vocabulary shifted when she was concentrating, becoming more precise and formal. The expensive watch she wore functional but clearly costly, that she sometimes touched nervously when the radio picked up fragments of financial news. It was while installing the cabin's interior walls that Clara revealed another piece of her puzzle. "I used to dream about having a kitchen like this," she said, running her hands along the rough-framed space that would become their cooking area. Small, efficient, designed for someone who actually uses it rather than just shows it off. "You didn't cook in your whole life?" "I had a kitchen that belonged in a magazine. All granite and stainless steel, barely used except when I entertained clients." Clara's expression grew distant. "I ate most of my meals at restaurants, or had them delivered. Food was just fuel, another item to optimize." Mason paused in his work, hammer suspended mid-swing. "That sounds lonely." It was. Everything was efficient, productive, measurable, and completely empty. Clara picked up Mason's brother's work gloves from where he'd set them down, running her fingers over the worn leather. "I convinced myself I was too busy for simple pleasures, too important for small moments. And now I know the difference between being busy and being alive." She handed him the gloves, their fingers touching in the transfer. Mason had started carrying Danny's gloves to every job, unable to use them, but unwilling to leave them behind. Clara was the first person who'd ever handled them with the reverence they deserved. "Tell me about him," she said softly. "About the guilt you carry." Mason sat heavily on a sawbuck, the gloves clutched in his hands. It was a conversation he'd avoided, even with himself, for 3 years. "The day Danny died, he called me at dawn. Wanted me to come work the logging site with him. They were short-handed, and the pay was good." Mason's voice was steady, but Clara could see the cost of the words in his expression. "I said no. I had a deck job in town, steady work with a contractor I'd worked for before. Safe work." Clara settled beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to crowd. "Danny laughed when I said I was playing it safe, said I was getting old, getting soft. But he wasn't angry. That wasn't his way. He just said he'd see me for dinner, and went off to work." Mason turned the gloves over in his hands. 3 hours later, a widowmaker came down. Old dead branch, invisible from the ground. Crushed him instantly. Mason. The worst part? I was relieved when he called. Relieved I had an excuse to skip the logging job because I didn't like the foreman, didn't trust the safety protocols. Mason's laugh was bitter. I chose comfort over watching out for my brother, and it got him killed. Clara took one of his hands in both of hers. You couldn't have known. Maybe not, but I should have been there. Should have been looking out for him like I always did, Mason met her eyes. My family was right to blame me. I failed the one person who mattered most. Is that why you keep moving? To punish yourself? The question hit closer to home than Mason expected. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just afraid that if I stay anywhere long enough, I'll fail someone else I care about. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her thumbs tracing patterns on the back of his hand. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Guilt has a way of convincing us we have more control over the world than we actually do. That if we just blame ourselves hard enough, somehow we can change what happened. Speaking from experience? Unfortunately, yes. Clara's expression grew, pained. I spent months after my company collapsed telling myself that if I'd just been smarter, more careful, more suspicious of the people I trusted, I could have prevented the whole thing. What happened? Clara released his hand and stood, pacing to the window opening that would soon hold glass. I built something I thought would help people. A platform that was supposed to democratize financial services, make investing and wealth building accessible to everyone. She stared out at the mountains. My partner convinced me to expand faster than we could handle, to take on investors who cared more about returns than our mission. Mason waited, understanding that some stories needed to be told. At their own pace, when the regulatory investigation started, when it became clear that we'd been manipulated into violating fiduciary responsibilities we didn't even know we had, my partner disappeared, left me holding the bag for decisions I thought we'd made. Together, Clara's shoulders sagged. Thousands of people lost money because they trusted me, because I trusted someone I shouldn't have. That's not the same as what happened to Danny, isn't it? I failed to protect people who were counting on me. My good intentions didn't matter when the results were devastating. Mason rose and moved, behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. The difference is that you cared. You were trying to help people, not harm them. The people who lost their savings don't care about my intentions. Maybe not. But intentions matter, Clara. They're what separate mistakes from malice. She leaned back against him, and Mason felt some of the tension leave her body. How do you live with it? The guilt, honestly? I don't know if I do live with it. I just carry it around and hope it gets easier. Mason pressed a kiss to the top of her head. But being here with you, building something together, it's the first time in 3 years that I've felt like I might deserve something good. Clara turned in his arms, her eyes bright with emotion. You deserve everything good, Mason. You deserve to be happy, to build a life, to stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. So do you. They held each other in the half-finished room, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work and growing love. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the trees, painting their mountain refuge in shades of gold and green. Can I tell you something? Clara asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Anything. I think your brother would be proud of you. Of the man you are, the work you do, the way you've survived something that could have destroyed you. Mason felt tears prick his eyes. I hope so. I know so. And I think he'd be happy that you found someone who sees how extraordinary you are. Clara, I love you, Mason. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. I know it's fast. I know it's complicated, but I love you. Mason cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. I love you too. God help me. I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. Their kiss this time was deeper, more urgent, carrying the weight of their shared confessions and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine weeks before. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara smiled up at him with an expression of pure joy. So what do we do now? She asked. Now we finish building our home, Mason said, the word carrying new weight as it left his lips. And we figure out the rest as we go. That evening, they sat by the fire sharing dreams for their completed cabin. Clara talked about the garden. She wanted to plant, a book she'd read by the fireplace during long winter evenings. Mason described the workshop he'd build, the furniture he'd craft for their home. They made plans like any couple building a life together, but underneath the domestic happiness ran a current of unspoken anxiety. Clara's past was still out there, waiting to intrude on their mountain sanctuary. And Mason's fear of failing someone he loved hadn't disappeared just because he'd acknowledged it. They were building something beautiful together, but both understood how fragile it might prove to be. As they prepared for bed, Clara to her tent, Mason to his sleeping bag under the stars. She paused at her tent flap. Mason? Yeah? Whatever happens, whatever comes next, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Mine, too. Clara disappeared into her tent, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts and the dying fire. He lay back in his sleeping bag, looking up at the stars that had become familiar friends, and allowed himself to imagine a future where love was enough to overcome the obstacles they hadn't yet faced. But in the back of his mind, Danny's voice whispered a warning. Happiness this good always came with a price. The newspaper article was wedged beneath a loose stone near the creek, its edges waterlogged and ink beginning to blur. Mason might have missed it entirely if the morning sun hadn't caught the white of the paper as he walked to check their water filtration system. Someone had been here recently, by the look of it, and left behind a piece of the outside, whirled like a message in a bottle. He almost threw it away without reading it. Almost. But something about the deliberate placement, the way it had been, weighted down rather than accidentally dropped, made him unfold the damp pages. The headline hit him like a physical blow. Tech mogul Clara Wynn vanishes amid bankruptcy scandal. Mason's hands shook as he read, his mind struggling to reconcile the words with the woman he'd fallen in love with. The article painted a picture of corporate malfeasance on a massive scale, billions in investor funds mismanaged, pension accounts wiped out, thousands of employees left jobless when Innovate Solutions collapsed virtually overnight. But it was the photograph that stopped his breathing entirely. Clara's face stared back at him from the newsprint, but not the Clara he knew. This woman wore a sharp business suit and an expression of cool authority. Her hair was styled differently, her makeup perfect, her smile polished for cameras. The caption read, "Former CEO Clara Wynn, whose net worth was estimated at $2.8 billion before the company's collapse." $2.8 billion. Mason sank onto a fallen log, the newspaper trembling in his hands. Every conversation they'd shared, every moment of growing intimacy, suddenly felt suspect. The woman who'd asked him to teach her basic carpentry skills was one of the wealthiest people in the country. The woman who'd worried about pulling her weight on a construction job could have bought and sold his entire life 1,000 times over. He read the article twice, then a third time, each pass revealing new details that recontextualized everything. He thought he knew. Clara hadn't just failed at business. She'd been at the center of one of the largest financial scandals in recent history. The article mentioned congressional hearings, criminal investigations, suicide attempts by investors who'd lost everything. Wynn maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. The article continued, claiming she was misled by her business partner, Marcus Thornfield, who authorities later discovered had been systematically embezzling funds while manipulating company records. However, as CEO, Wynn bore ultimate responsibility for the oversight failures that enabled the fraud. The worst part was that the article was dated only 3 days ago. Someone had driven up here, hiked to their remote clearing, and deliberately left this for him to find. Someone wanted him to know exactly who Clara really was. Mason's mind raced through the implications. Every helicopter delivery, every casual dismissal of cost, every moment when Clara had seemed slightly out of place in their wilderness setting. It all made terrible sense now. She hadn't been a successful business executive escaping a scandal. She'd been a billionaire, running from one of the biggest corporate disasters in American history. The sound of footsteps approaching made him look up sharply. Clara emerged from the trees, carrying a basket of wild berries she'd been gathering for breakfast. She was humming softly, her face relaxed and happy in a way he'd come to treasure. She looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with. Practical clothes, hair in a simple braid, hands stained with berry juice, and honest work. She looked nothing like the polished executive in the photograph. "You're up early," Clara called, her smile bright with affection. "I found a whole patch of huckleberries down by the—" She stopped abruptly, her expression shifting as she registered the newspaper in his hands and the look on his face. "Mason?" Her voice was careful now, guarded. "What's wrong?" He held up the article without speaking, watching her face transform as she recognized the headline, the photograph, the exposure of everything she'd hidden from him. The color drained from her cheeks, and the basket of berries slipped from her hands, scattering purple fruit across the ground. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Someone left it by the creek. Someone who wanted me to know exactly who I've been sharing my bed with." Clara flinched at the harsh tone in his voice. "Mason, let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you're worth nearly $3 billion? That you're not some business executive who made mistakes, but the CEO who destroyed thousands of people's lives?" Mason stood up, the newspaper crumpled in his fist. "That everything you've told me has been a lie?" "Not everything," Clara said desperately. "Yes, I was the CEO of Innovate Solutions. Yes, I'm wealthy, or I was, before the bankruptcy. But everything I told you about what happened, about being betrayed by my partner, about taking the fall, for decisions I didn't fully understand, that was all true. $2.8 billion, Clara. Do you have any idea what that means to someone like me? It's just money." "Just money?" Mason's laugh was bitter. "I've spent 3 years living out of my truck, taking whatever work I could find, worrying about whether I'd have enough saved to get through a slow season. And you're telling me that billions of dollars is just money?" Clara took a step toward him, her hands outstretched. "Mason, the amount doesn't matter. I walked away from all of it. I'm here because I wanted a different life, a real life with you. You didn't walk away from it. You ran away from the consequences of what you did with it." Mason shook his head, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "How many people lost their homes because of your company? How many families were destroyed?" "I didn't know," Clara said, tears streaming down her face now. "I trusted Marcus. I believed what the lawyers told me. I thought we were helping people. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because you were too busy counting your billions to pay attention to what was happening to the little people who trusted you." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one driving her back a step. "That's not fair. You don't understand the pressure, the complexity." "You're right. I don't understand how someone can be worth $3 billion and still claim to be a victim." They stared at each other across the scattered berries, the newspaper article lying between them like an insurmountable barrier. Everything Mason had believed about their relationship, about Clara's character, about the future they'd planned together, crumbled in the space of minutes. "I was going to tell you," Clara said quietly. "When the cabin was finished, when we'd had more time to build what we have here, I was going to tell you everything. When you got bored playing house with the working man? When you decided to go back to your real life." "This is my real life now," Clara insisted. "Everything I've told you about wanting to build something meaningful, about caring for you, about choosing this life over the one I had, that's all true. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? You've been lying to me since the day we met." "I've never lied to you. I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing, and you know it." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, looking suddenly fragile despite the revelation of her immense wealth. "Mason, please. What we have together, what we've built here, it's real. It's more real than anything I've ever experienced. What we have is based on a lie. You let me think we were equals. Let me worry about whether I was good enough for you. When the truth is, I could work my entire life and never earn what you probably spend on shoes. I don't care about the money, Clara said desperately. I never cared about the money. It was always a burden, always something that separated me from real connections with people. Then why didn't you tell me? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Because I was afraid of exactly this. Afraid you'd look at me differently, treat me differently. Afraid you'd think our relationship was about something other than who we are together. And now I don't know who you are at all. Mason turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of her tears. Every shared moment, every intimate conversation, every kiss, all of it felt tainted now by the knowledge of what she'd hidden from him. The woman he'd fallen in love with might not even exist outside his imagination. The Clara I know doesn't have billions of dollars, he said without turning around. The Clara I know doesn't have blood on her hands from corporate fraud. The Clara I know isn't someone I've been living a fantasy with. I'm the same person I was yesterday, Clara pleaded. The same person who learned to frame walls and split firewood and make tea over a camp stove. The same person who told you she loved you. No, Mason said firmly. Yesterday, I thought you were someone who chose this life freely, who had given up a comfortable but empty existence to build something real. Today, I find out you're someone who destroyed thousands of lives and is hiding from the consequences in a luxury wilderness retreat. He finally turned to face her, and the pain in her eyes almost made him waver. Almost. I need time to think, he said. I need you to not be here right now. Clara's face crumpled. Mason, please don't. I'm not throwing you out. This is your land, your cabin, your project. But I can't. I can't look at you right now without seeing that photograph, without thinking about all the ways I've been an idiot. You haven't been an idiot. You've been everything I hoped you could be. I've been a mark, Clara. A convenient way for you to play at being normal while you wait for the heat to die down. That's not true, isn't it? Rich woman hides in the sin. Mountains with a simple carpenter who doesn't ask too many questions. It's a perfect cover story. Clara looked as if he'd slapped her. You think I've been using you? I think I don't know what to think anymore. Mason walked toward the cabin they'd built together, every timber and joint now feeling like evidence of his own naivety. At the doorway, he paused without turning around. I'll finish the work. It's what you're paying me for. But after that, he couldn't complete the sentence. After that, what? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. After that, I think you'll be just fine without me. People like you always are. Mason disappeared into the cabin, leaving Clara standing alone among the scattered berries, the crumpled newspaper at her feet, and the ruins of everything they'd built together. The mountains stood silent around them, keeping their secrets as they always had, indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadow. 4. The first time since she'd arrived in this remote meadow, Clara felt truly alone. The cabin stood between them like a monument to everything they'd lost. For 3 days, Mason worked with mechanical precision, installing trim and finishing touches with the kind of focused intensity that blocked out everything except the immediate task at hand. Clara remained in the clearing, maintaining the campsite, preparing meals that Mason barely touched, and giving him the space he'd demanded, while never straying far enough that he couldn't see her. She didn't try to explain again, didn't plead or apologize or attempt to breach the wall of silence he'd erected between them. Instead, she simply existed in his peripheral vision, a constant reminder of his own foolishness and the dream he'd been too naive to recognize as fantasy. The nearly completed cabin mocked him with every carefully fitted joint, every perfectly aligned board. They'd built it together, their hands shaping every detail, their shared vision guiding every decision. Now it felt like a monument to his own stupidity, a beautiful lie made of timber and stone. On the morning of the fourth day, Mason emerged from the cabin to find Clara packing her camping gear with the systematic efficiency he'd come to associate with her business persona. The sight of her dismantling their shared life sent an unexpected jolt of panic through his chest. "Where are you going?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Clara looked up from stuffing her sleeping bag, her face carefully composed, but her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "You said you needed me not to be here. I'm respecting that." "I said I needed time to think. You've had 3 days. And from the way you can barely look at me, I think you've reached your conclusion." Mason found himself at a loss for words. He'd expected her to fight harder, to refuse to leave, to use her wealth and influence to somehow force a resolution. The fact that she was quietly accepting his rejection felt both like vindication and abandonment. "The cabin's nearly finished," he said finally. "Nearly is good enough. You've fulfilled your contract. That's not." Mason struggled with the unexpected realization that he didn't want the work to end, even under these circumstances. There's still detail work. The interior needs Mason. Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "Let's not pretend this is about construction." She was right, and they both knew it. The cabin could be completed by any competent carpenter. What couldn't be finished was the life they'd planned to build inside it. "I called for a helicopter pickup," Clara continued, folding clothes with the same precise movements she brought to everything else. "It'll be here in a few hours. Where will you go?" Clara paused in her packing. "I don't know. Somewhere I can figure out how to live with what I've done. How to make amends for the people I hurt, even if they never forgive me." There was something in her tone, not self-pity, but a kind of quiet resolve that made Mason look at her more closely. This wasn't the desperate woman who'd pleaded with him 3 days ago. This was someone who'd made a decision. "Clara, I want you to keep the cabin." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "The land, the cabin, everything. It's yours." Clara resumed her packing without meeting his eyes. "I had my lawyers draw up the papers. The deed transfer is in the folder on the table inside." Mason stared at her in shock. "I can't accept that." "Why not? You built it. Your hands shaped every board. Your skill made it real. It should belong to someone who understands its value." "Clara, a property like this has to be worth money again." Clara's smile was sad. "It's always about money, isn't it? The curse of having too much is that people can never see past it to what actually matters. This isn't about money. It's about what? About the fact that I can afford to give away $1 million property without thinking twice. About how that makes you feel small and inadequate." Clara finally looked at him directly. "Or is it about the fact that I'm trying to give you something beautiful because I love you, and you can't accept it because of where it comes from?" Mason felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You think you can buy forgiveness?" "No. I think I can make sure that something good comes out of this disaster, that the home we built together goes to someone who'll appreciate it instead of sitting empty while lawyers fight over it." The helicopter's distant rotors interrupted whatever Mason might have said. They both turned toward the sound, watching the aircraft approach across the morning sky like an emissary from the world they'd tried to leave behind. "I need to tell you something," Clara said quickly, her composure finally cracking. "About the newspaper article. About how it got here." Mason's attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" "I think it was Marcus, my former partner. He's been fighting the criminal charges, trying to shift all the blame onto me. If he could prove I was hiding assets, lying about my involvement." Clara shook her head. "He's been having me followed. He probably found out about this place, about you." "You think he's been watching us?" "I think he wanted you to find out about me this way, wanted to hurt me by destroying the one good thing I'd found." Clara's voice hardened, and it worked perfectly. The revelation added another layer of violation to Mason's sense of betrayal, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about his own reaction. Had he been manipulated into destroying their relationship? Had his righteous anger been exactly what Clara's enemy had hoped to achieve? Why didn't you tell me this 3 days ago? Because it doesn't change the facts. I am who that article says I am. I did make the decisions that led to people getting hurt. The newspaper didn't lie about any of that. The helicopter was close enough now that conversation became difficult. Clara shouldered her pack and walked toward the landing zone they'd used for supply deliveries, her movements carrying the kind of dignity Mason had always associated with. Her but now understood came from a lifetime of wealth and privilege. He followed her, driven by an impulse he couldn't name. As the aircraft touched down and the pilot began loading her gear, Clara turned to face him one last time. I want you to know, she said, raising her voice over the rotor noise, that these months with you have been the most honest I've ever been in my life. Not because I told you everything about my past, but because I could finally be the person I wanted to be, instead of the person everyone expected me to be. Clara, I fell in love with you because you saw me as someone worth teaching, worth caring, for worth building a life with. Not because of what I owned or what I could do for you, but because of who I was when we were working together. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained steady. That person was real, Mason. Whatever else was false, that person was completely real. She climbed into the helicopter without looking back. Mason stood frozen as the aircraft lifted off, taking Clara away from their mountain refuge and back to whatever consequences awaited her in the world beyond. He watched until the helicopter disappeared over the tree line, leaving him alone with the completed cabin and the weight of choices he was no longer sure he understood. Inside the cabin, he found the deed transfer exactly where Clara had said it would be. His name was written in careful legal script as the new owner of property worth more than he'd earned in a lifetime. Attached to the paperwork was a handwritten note in Clara's familiar writing. Mason, this place taught me what home could feel like. You taught me what love could feel like. I hope someday you'll forgive me for not trusting you with the truth from the beginning. I hope someday you'll understand that loving you was the most honest thing I've ever done. C. Mason sank into one of the chairs they positioned by the window to capture the mountain view. The silence felt different, now not peaceful, but hollow. For weeks, this clearing had been filled with the sounds of their shared work, their conversations, their laughter. Now it echoed with absence. He looked around the cabin they built together, seeing Clara's influence in every detail. The kitchen designed for someone who actually cooked. The reading nook positioned to catch morning light. The wide windows that brought the mountains inside. This wasn't just a structure. It was a dream made manifest, shaped by two people who dared to imagine a life together. But the woman who'd shared that dream was also the woman responsible for one of the biggest financial scandals in recent history. The same hands that had learned to frame walls and split firewood had signed documents that destroyed thousands of lives. The same heart that had opened to him with such vulnerability had been hardened by years of corporate ruthlessness. Mason picked up Clara's note and read it again, searching for some sign of manipulation or dishonesty in the carefully formed letters. Instead, he found only the echo of the woman he'd fallen in love with, someone who valued honesty and connection above the trappings of wealth, someone who'd been willing to risk everything for the possibility of building something real. Had he thrown away the most genuine relationship of his life because he couldn't see past dollar signs? Had his own insecurities and prejudices made him exactly the kind of person Clara had feared he might become? As the sun set over the mountains, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber, Mason sat alone with his doubts and the growing realization that he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. The deed to $1 million property lay on the table beside him, but what he really wanted was the woman who'd loved him enough to give it away. The final cabin door hung on its hinges, like an accusation. Mason had spent the entire morning fitting the last piece of hardware, adjusting the strike plate with obsessive precision that had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with the growing certainty that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He'd crafted the door himself from local pine, its panels carved with the same care he'd brought to Clara's wooden spoon weeks ago. It was meant to be their door, the entrance to the home they'd build together, the threshold they'd cross as partners. Now it stood as a monument to his own stubborn pride and wounded ego. The silence pressed against him from all sides. No mourning. Conversations over coffee. No questions about technique or requests for patient instruction. No laughter echoing across the clearing when Clara inevitably found some new way to surprise herself with her growing competence. The absence of her presence made the completed cabin feel like a mausoleum. Mason stepped back to examine his work, running his eyes over the perfect fit of wood against frame. The door was beautiful functional art that would last generations if properly maintained. It was also completely pointless without someone to share it with. His phone buzzed against his leg. The first call he'd received since Clara's departure, 3 days ago. He almost ignored it, then recognized Bill Hendrick's number from the business card the rancher had left during his visit. "Mason? It's Bill. Hope you don't mind me calling." "Not at all." Mason's voice came out rougher than intended, hoarse from disuse. "Listen, I wanted to check on you folks up there. Heard helicopter activity a few days back." And Bill paused. "Well, I saw the lady in town yesterday, at the diner. She looked like someone who'd had the world fall on her." Mason's chest tightened. "She was in town, sitting alone in a corner booth, hardly touched her food. Looked like she'd been crying for days." Bill's voice carried the careful concern of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize real heartbreak. "She asked me about bus schedules to Denver. Seemed like someone who needed help but wouldn't ask for it." "Did you talk to her?" "Tried to. She was polite enough, but—" Another pause. "Son, I may be old, but I'm not blind. Whatever happened between you two, that woman is hurting bad." Mason closed his eyes, imagining Clara alone in a small-town diner, preparing to disappear back into the world that had chewed her up and spit her out. "It's complicated, Bill. Most things worth doing are complicated." Bill's tone gentled. "Look, I don't know what your business is, and it's not my place to interfere, but I've been married to the same woman for 43 years, and I can tell you this much pride's a cold companion when you're lying alone at night." After Bill hung up, Mason stood in the doorway of his completed cabin, staring out at the clearing where Clara's tent had been. The morning light slanted through the trees, exactly as it had when she'd first shown him this place, when her eyes had lit up with the possibility of building something real together. He thought about her hands learning to grip a hammer properly, her stubborn determination to pull her weight despite her inexperience, the way she'd listened to his stories about Danny without judgment or pity, the careful reverence with which she'd handled his brother's work gloves, the pressed wildflower that still marked a page in his notebook. Most of all, he thought about what she'd said before the helicopter took her away. That person was real. Mason. Whatever else was false, that person was completely real. Had she been lying then? Had the woman who'd learned to split firewood and make camp coffee been an elaborate performance? Or had Clara Wynn, Billionaire CEO, been the performance, and the woman who'd fallen asleep in his arms during a mountain storm been the truth? Underneath? Mason walked to the window that faced the meadow's eastern edge, where the creek ran clear and cold toward distant valleys. Clara had mentioned wanting to plant a garden here, had talked about reading by the fireplace during winter evenings, had dreamed aloud about the simple life they'd build in this remote refuge. Those dreams hadn't been about money or status or corporate power. They'd been about morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, about the satisfaction of work done with careful hands, about the peace that came from loving someone who saw you clearly and chose to stay anyway, What if Clara's wealth wasn't the most important thing about her? What if it was just another burden she'd been carrying, another obstacle to the authentic connection she'd been seeking? What if Mason's reaction had proven her worst fears about how money poisoned every relationship she tried to build? He thought about his brother Danny, who'd never met a person he couldn't find something to love about. Danny would have been fascinated by Clara's story, would have seen the courage it took to walk away from billions of dollars in search of something more meaningful. Danny wouldn't have cared about corporate scandals or financial investigations. He would have cared about the woman who'd learned to trust again despite being betrayed by someone she'd loved. You deserve to be happy. Mason, Clara, had told him, you deserve to stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. But what if he was punishing himself again? What if his refusal to forgive Clara for her past was just another way of avoiding the risk of caring too deeply about someone he might lose? Mason picked up the deed transfer from the table, reading Clara's handwritten note for the 100th time. Every word carried the weight of genuine emotion, the kind of raw honesty that couldn't be faked or manufactured. This wasn't the calculated gesture of a manipulative billionaire. It was the desperate gift of a woman who'd found love and thrown it away through her own fear and shame. Just as he was throwing it away through his. The irony was almost too painful to acknowledge. They'd both been so afraid of their pasts destroying their future that they'd destroyed it themselves. Clara by hiding her identity out of fear that he'd see her differently. Mason by proving her fears completely justified. He thought about all the moments when Clara had tried to tell him more about her background, all the times she'd started to reveal deeper truths before pulling back. She'd been testing the waters, trying to gauge whether he could handle the complete truth about who she was. And every time his insecurities or prejudices had shown through, she'd retreated further behind. Her walls. What if she'd been trying to protect them both from exactly what had happened? What if her gradual revelation of her past had been an act of love rather than deception? Mason looked around the cabin one more time, seeing it now not as evidence of his naivety, but as proof of what they'd been capable of building together. Every joint, every fitted board, every carefully planned detail represented hours of shared work and growing trust. This wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to partnership, to the possibility of two damaged people healing each other through honest labor and patient love. Clara had given him more than $1 million property. She'd given him the chance to build something meaningful with his hands and heart. She'd helped him remember that he was worthy of love, capable of creating beauty, deserving of happiness despite his failures, and he'd thrown it all away because he couldn't see past dollar. Signs to the woman who'd loved him enough to risk everything. The bus to Denver left at 4 o'clock. Bill had mentioned that casually, probably hoping Mason would put the pieces together. It was nearly 2 now, which meant Clara was probably already at the small terminal, waiting to disappear back into a world that would never love her the way he had, the way he still did. Mason grabbed his truck keys, his heart pounding with the sudden urgency of a man who'd finally understood what he was about to lose forever. The cabin could wait. The door could remain unhung for a few more hours. What mattered was reaching Clara before she vanished into the anonymous vastness of the world beyond these mountains. What mattered was fighting for the love he'd been too proud and too afraid to defend when it counted most. The truck started on. The first try, and Mason drove toward town with the desperate intensity of a man racing against time and his own stubborn heart. The bus was already idling outside the small terminal when Mason's truck skidded into the gravel parking lot, diesel exhaust mixing with the afternoon heat. Through the dusty windows, he could see passengers settling into their seats, preparing for the long journey back to the world of cities and complications and lives, lived at a distance from mountain silence. Clara sat in the last row, her face turned toward the window, one hand pressed against the glass as if she could somehow touch the peaks that had become her sanctuary. She wore the same practical clothes she'd favored during their time together. But something about her posture spoke of defeat, shoulders curved inward, head bowed, the confident carriage he'd come to associate with her, replaced by the weight of someone who'd stopped believing in second chances. Mason ran toward the bus, his boots slipping on loose gravel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The driver was already reaching for the door lever when Mason pounded on the metal siding. "Wait, please." The door hissed open, and Mason found himself facing a tired-looking man in his 50s, who clearly wanted to stay on schedule. "You buying a ticket, son?" "No. There's someone on board I need to talk to." The driver's expression suggested he'd dealt with too many dramatic romantic gestures to find them charming. "Bus leaves in 2 minutes. You can buy a ticket to Denver if you want to talk to someone that bad." Mason looked past the driver to where Clara sat frozen in her seat, her reflection in the window showing eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Other passengers were beginning to turn and stare, their faces carrying the mild interest of people grateful for any distraction from a long bus ride. "Clara," Mason called down the narrow aisle. "Please, I need to talk to you." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond the tremor in her hands that suggested she was fighting every instinct that urged her to run toward him. "Sir, you're holding up my schedule," the driver said firmly. Mason pulled out his wallet, extracting what cash he had enough for a one-way ticket to Denver and little else. One ticket. The driver took his money with the weary efficiency of someone who'd learned not to question human folly. Mason made his way down the aisle, ignoring the curious stares of other passengers. His attention focused entirely on the woman who'd become his reason for believing in love. He settled into the empty seat beside Clara, close enough to smell the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with mountain air that still clung to her clothes. She kept her face turned toward the window, but he could see tears tracking down her cheeks in the reflection. "You came," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it over the bus engine's rumble. "I'm an idiot," Mason said simply. A proud, stubborn, terrified idiot who almost let the best thing in his life disappear because he couldn't see past his own insecurities. Clara finally turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but cautiously hopeful. "Mason, let me finish, please." He took her hands in his, noting how cold her fingers were despite the afternoon heat. "I was wrong. About everything. About what matters. About who you are. About what we have together." The bus lurched into motion, carrying them away from the small town and toward whatever future they might manage to salvage. Clara didn't seem to notice, her attention fixed entirely on his face. "I spent 3 days convincing myself that you'd been lying to me," Mason continued. "That everything between us was some kind of elaborate deception. But the truth is, I was lying to myself. About what? About being afraid. About thinking I wasn't good enough for you, even before I knew who you really were." Mason's voice roughened with emotion. "When I found out about your money, about your past, it gave me an excuse to run, because loving you completely, trusting you completely, would mean risking everything I have left." Clara's tears came harder now, but she didn't pull her hands away. "I should have told you from the beginning. I should have trusted you with the truth. Maybe, but I should have trusted you too. Should have believed that the woman who learned to split firewood and made terrible coffee and fell asleep in my arms during a storm was the real you." Mason brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Because she was real, wasn't she? That woman was completely, authentically you." "More real than I'd ever been in my life," Clara admitted. "When I was with you, I could finally be the person I'd always wanted to be, instead of the person everyone expected me to be. Then that's who I fell in love with. That's who I want to build a life with." Mason cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I don't care about your money, Clara. I don't care about your past mistakes or your corporate scandals or whatever legal battles you're facing. I care about you, but the people who were hurt because of me will have to decide for themselves whether to forgive you. That's not my choice to make, and it's not what determines whether you deserve love." Mason's voice was firm but gentle. "You made mistakes. So did I. So did Danny. So does everyone who tries to build something meaningful in this world." Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if she could absorb comfort through her skin. "I was so afraid you'd see me differently if you knew the truth." "I do see you differently," Mason admitted. "I see someone who had everything the world says should matter and gave it up for something real. I see someone brave enough to walk away from billions of dollars because she finally understood what actually had value. What if I can't make up for what I did? What if the people I hurt never forgive me? Then you'll have to live with that. But you don't have to live with it alone." Mason tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "I want to be there while you figure out how to make amends. I want to help you build something better out of the wreckage of what came before." Clara's smile was tremulous but genuine. "Even though I'm probably going to be tied up in legal proceedings for years? Even though loving me means dealing with reporters and investigators and all the mess I've dragged behind me? Especially then, because that's when you'll need someone who loves you for who you are, not what you can do for them." They sat in silence for several miles, hands intertwined, both processing the magnitude of what they were choosing. The landscape outside shifted, from mountains to foothills to rolling plains, but Mason barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the woman beside him and the fragile hope growing between them. "I have something to tell you," Clara said eventually, "about why I really came to the mountains." Mason waited, understanding that some confessions couldn't be rushed. "I wasn't just hiding from the scandal. I was hiding from myself. From the realization that I'd spent 15 years building a life that felt like it belonged to someone else." Clara's voice was steady now, clearer than it had been since he'd found her on the bus. "When everything collapsed, when I lost the company and the reputation and all the trappings of success, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But you hadn't. No, I'd lost everything that didn't matter, which left room for me to find what did." Clara turned to face him fully. "I didn't hire a man to build me a cabin, Mason. I hired someone to remind me what home feels like." The words hung between them, weighted with the promise of futures neither had dared imagine weeks before. Mason felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't experienced since before Danny's death. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we go back," Clara said simply. "Back to our mountain, back to our cabin, back to the life we were building before fear got in the way." "What about Denver? The legal proceedings? They'll wait. My lawyers have been handling things for months without me. A few more days won't matter." Clara's smile grew stronger. "Besides, we have a door to hang, and a garden to plant, and a life to figure out together." Mason kissed her then, soft and sure, tasting salt. From her tears and the promise of tomorrows they'd almost thrown away. Around them, the bus carried strangers toward their own destinations and decisions. But Mason and Clara had already found where they belonged, in each other's arms, heading home to a cabin built with love and second chances, ready to face whatever complications the future might bring as long as they faced them together. The mountains were calling them back, and this time they were both ready to answer. 6 months later, Mason woke to the sound of coffee brewing and Clara humming softly in their kitchen. Snow pressed against the windows of the completed cabin, but inside, the fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth they'd built together during the last days of autumn. The morning light filtering through frost-covered glass painted everything in shades of gold and amber, transforming their mountain refuge into something that belonged in a fairy tale. Clara stood at the counter wearing one of his flannel shirts over her pajamas, her hair loose around her shoulders as she prepared breakfast with the confident movements of someone who'd learned to feel at home in her own skin. The expensive hiking boots had been replaced by wool socks and comfortable slippers. The carefully composed business executive had given way entirely to a woman who measured success in split firewood and perfectly risen bread. "Morning, Mason," sighed, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Morning yourself." Clara leaned back against him, her warmth seeping through his t-shirt. "Sleep well? Better than I have in years?" It was true, and nightmares about Danny had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the life he and Clara were building together. The guilt that had driven him from job to job, town to town, had loosened its grip, not because the pain was gone, but because Clara had helped him understand the difference between honoring his brother's memory and punishing himself for surviving. On the kitchen table sat a new set of house keys, simple brass keys attached to a wooden fob. Mason had carved from a piece of the pine they'd used for the cabin's trim. Clara had insisted on the ceremony of officially accepting them, even though she'd been living here as his partner for months. Some rituals, she'd learned, mattered more for their symbolic weight than their practical necessity. "Any word from your lawyers?" Mason asked, settling into one of the chairs they'd positioned to catch the morning light. "The final settlement was approved yesterday." Clara brought him coffee in the wooden mug he'd made to match her carved spoon and other. Small piece of their shared domestic mythology. The last of the restitution payments went out to the affected investors. It had taken most of Clara's remaining wealth to make things right, but she'd insisted on going beyond what the courts required. Every pension fund, every individual investor, every employee who'd lost their job when Innovate Solutions collapsed had received compensation that reflected not just their financial losses, but the disruption to their lives. Clara would never be poor. Her early investments had been too shrewd for that, but she'd given up any claim to the billionaire status that had once defined her. "How does it feel?" Mason asked. "Like I can finally breathe." Clara settled beside him, her feet tucked under her legs. "I know it doesn't undo the harm that was done, but at least I've done everything I can to make it right." Through the window, Mason could see the garden plots they'd prepared for spring planting, currently buried under 2 feet of snow, but ready to burst into life when the weather turned. Clara had spent hours poring over seed catalogs, planting vegetables and herbs, with the same intensity she'd once brought to corporate strategy. The difference was that now her plans involved nurturing growth rather than maximizing profit. "I have something for you," Clara said, reaching into the pocket of her flannel shirt. She pulled out a small wrapped package, her expression mixing nervous excitement with the kind of anticipation that comes with giving a gift that truly matters. Mason unwrapped it carefully, revealing a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image showed him and Clara working on the cabin's roof, taken from a distance with a long lens. They were both focused on their work, but even in profile, the connection between them was obvious the way they moved around each other with unconscious coordination, the natural ease of 2 people who'd learned to function as a team. "When did you take this?" "I didn't. Bill Hendricks did, the day he visited us last summer. He brought me a copy when I was in town yesterday." Clara's smile was soft with memory. "He said he wanted to capture what real partnership looked like." Mason studied the photograph, seeing not just the moment it preserved, but the entire journey it represented. 2 people who'd been broken by their pasts, learning to build something beautiful together. 2 hearts that had been closed by betrayal and loss, opening to the possibility of love that asked for nothing but honesty and presence. "He was right," Mason said quietly, "about what partnership looks like. We've been good partners, haven't we? The best." Clara took his free hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Mason, there's something else I want to talk to you about." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. She was smiling, but there was a nervousness underneath that suggested whatever she wanted to discuss was significant. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about what we want to build next. Not with wood and nails, but Clara paused, gathering courage. "I want to build a family with you, Mason. I want to have children who grow up understanding that real wealth comes from love and honest work, and the kind of community we found here." Mason felt his heart expand in his chest, filled with a happiness so complete it bordered on overwhelming. Children who know how to split firewood and plant gardens and treat people with dignity regardless of what they own. Children who understand. That home isn't a place you buy, it's something you build with the people you love. Mason set down the photograph and cupped Clara's face in his hands, seeing in her eyes the future they'd never dared imagine when they'd first met in this mountain. Clearing. "Are you proposing to me, Clara Wynn?" "I'm proposing that we stop being afraid of what we might lose and start focusing on what we want to build." Clara's smile was radiant. "But if you need me to be more specific, then yes. I'm asking you to marry me, Mason Holt. I'm asking you to be my partner in everything work and rest, joy and sorrow, all the ordinary moments that make a life worth living." Mason's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises, like second chances, and the kind of love that survives everything the world throws at it. When they broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Clara reached into her other pocket and produced a simple gold band. "I know it's traditional for the man to propose," she said, slipping the ring onto his finger with hands that shook slightly with emotion. "But I've never been very good at following traditions. Good thing I love unconventional women." They sat by the window as the morning light strengthened, planning a wedding that would happen here in their meadow, surrounded by the mountains that had brought them together and the community of neighbors who'd become their chosen family. Bill and his wife would be there, of course, along with Clara's lawyers who'd become friends during the long process of making amends. Mason's estranged parents had even agreed to come, ready to meet the woman who'd helped their son find his way back to believing in family. The ceremony would be simple. No corporate guests or society photographers, just the people who mattered celebrating two hearts that had learned to trust again. Clara would wear a dress she'd sewn herself, and Mason would carry Danny's work gloves in his pocket, a way of including his brother in the moment that marked his transition from survivor to someone ready to thrive. As they talked and planned, snow continued to fall outside their windows, blanketing their mountain refuge in pristine white. But inside the cabin they'd built with their own hands, warmth radiated from more than just the fireplace. It came from the knowledge that they'd found something precious and rare, a love built on honesty and acceptance, strong enough to weather any storm. The cabin held them like a promise fulfilled, its walls containing not just their possessions, but their dreams, their hopes, their commitment to building a life that honored both their past struggles and their future possibilities. The handcrafted door stood ready to welcome friends and family. The windows framed views of mountains that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to lovers who'd chosen each other completely. Outside, the wilderness stretched endlessly, beautiful and challenging and indifferent to human concerns. But inside, Mason and Clara had created something even more precious than the natural beauty surrounding them. They'd created home. Not the kind that money could buy, but the kind that love and patience and honest work built one day at a time. As afternoon faded into evening, and they prepared dinner together in their well-used kitchen. Clara wore the wooden spoon Mason had carved for her like a badge of honor. Mason used the coffee mug she'd commissioned from a local potter, decorated with mountains and trees that looked remarkably like the view from their window. These simple objects, spoon and mug, keys and photograph, told the story of their love better than any grand gesture ever could. They spoke of attention paid and care given, of two people who'd learned that the most profound intimacy came not from grand declarations, but from the accumulated weight of small kindnesses offered daily. Later, as they sat by the fire sharing stories and making plans, Mason understood that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for in all those years of wandering. Not just a place to stay, but a reason to stop running. Not just work to fill his days, but purpose that filled his heart. Clara had given him more than love. She'd given him back his faith in the possibility of building something lasting and beautiful in a world that seemed determined to tear down everything worth preserving. In return, he'd given her the gift of being seen and accepted completely, wealth and scandals and all. Together, they'd built more than a cabin. They'd built a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a future bright with the promise of all the tomorrows they'd face side by side. The mountains stood sentinel around them, keeping their secrets and their promises safe beneath an infinite canopy of stars.